fancy restaurant. This is a fancy restaurant. This is a fancy restaurant. It's a fancy. It's a fancy restaurant.
Welcome to Season 5 of How Would Lubitsch Do It, a podcast in which we discuss the works of director Ernst Lubitsch, one film at a time. It's 1941, and Lance St. Laurent joins us to discuss that uncertain feeling, as well as some comedic theory. Come visit ernstcast.com if you'd like show notes, resources as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing, a link to our Discord, or just to say hi. Hello, everyone. We're here with Lance St. Laurent. Lance, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself? What do you do, and what in God's name convinced you that you wanted to talk about that uncertain feeling?
I am an academic, or an aspiring academic at least. I'm a PhD student at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, and I'm currently working on a dissertation related to American film comedy. I'm also just an online poster. I'm a former Jeopardy champion. Comedy would be my specialty. As to why I picked that uncertain feeling, I thought this was an interesting choice as a mixture of sort of interesting creative voices. Of course, Ernst Lubitsch, but also our writer here is David Ogden Phillips. Am I remembering that name correctly?
Mm-hmm.
Of the Philadelphia Story, of Holiday. It's a well-known comedy writer. And, this cast, Melvin Douglas and Burgess Meredith, was interesting to me. But I knew nothing about this movie going in. And so I was pleasantly surprised with how much I liked it, but I'm getting ahead of myself.
I thought it'd be a fun novelty for me to hold off on watching this until before the episode, because this is the only film in about 2 seasons that I'm not over familiar with at this point. I just watched it for the first time 2 days ago, and I was a little shocked at how much I liked it. It's minor, but we'll get into that. Before we get into the meat of the episode, we do have some historical stuff to talk about, because this film comes at a very interesting time in Lubitsch's career. If listeners for the previous 2 episodes might remember, Ernst Lubitsch has made a deal with MGM to produce 2 films, one of which he desperately wanted to do, which is Shop Around the Corner, and the film he agreed to on the condition he makes Shop Around the Corner, which was Ninotchka. Lubitsch has finished that contract. He is a free agent. So he has now decided to, once again, this is his latest in a line of attempts to go independent. That started in Berlin. He teams up with producer Saul Lesser. He signs a 4-movie contract with Saul. And these are going to be lower budget films, average of around $400,000, a little lower than what he's been working with MGM. They get off to the start. They're looking for material. They decide to remake Kiss Me Again. This is a very loose Kiss Me Again remake, although Kiss Me Again is now lost. We can't really know if this is a Marriage Circle 1 Hour With You type situation fully, because the film is lost, unfortunately. The decision, of material was made easier by the fact that Alexander Korda, who will become very important in our To Be or Not To Be episode, wanted a vehicle for his wife, Merle Oberon, and so this film was born. The film was shot in late 1940 and released in spring of 1941. It kind of has this reputation of being a bomb. It wasn't. It made about $100,000 in profit. It grossed about $848,000 worldwide. Not great. Certainly not to the standards of Shop Around the Corner, but not a disaster. And yet the film kind of came and went. And, as a sign of just how little, for example, Saul Lesser cared for the film, he let the rights to the film, the actual copyright materials, were lost at sea in September of 1941. Saul Lesser apparently wired the UA with this message: "We do not feel it necessary to copyright the story of that uncertain feeling in England. The $28 it would take to renew the copyright or to deal with that was too big of an expense. So as a result, the film has fallen out of copyright and is accessible to all. Hooray, I can post it." And so we have that uncertain feeling. So Lance, what did we think of this movie? I'm curious as to your thoughts. What's the verdict on the film that comes in between, by far, his 2 most popular films?
I don't mean this as a dig on it, but it is certainly, like you said, it's a minor film. It's a very sort of small stakes, small premise, mostly dealing with this one couple and this one sort of interloper into the couple, very limited locations, and, certainly nothing of the sort of like high energy hijinks of something like Donald Ogden Stewart's other very famous screenplay, The Philadelphia Story. It doesn't reach that sort of level of screwball hijinks, but in terms of telling this story of a very early story of sort of domestic malaise and psychoanalysis and the destabilizing presence of artistic types. I did find it very satisfying. Merle Oberon is an actress who is not familiar to me. I don't think I've seen anything with her, certainly nothing this prominent. And I found her to be, very winning, center of this love triangle. But really, the dynamic between Burgess Meredith and Melvyn Douglas, of course, returning from Ninotchka and Angel, but a very different register from him here than something like Ninotchka, where he's the suave cad in Ninotchka. And here he is, I think he even wrote this down, he's just a poor, ignorant insurance dope, as he describes himself.
The only way he can actually tackle his marital problems is through the lens of consumerism, right? I need a new angle on my marriage as a salesman.
Mm-hmm. A new spin, I think it describes.
New spin, yeah.
Yes, yeah. I need to pitch my marriage in this new way to save it. The real, I think, sort of standout here is Burgess Meredith giving a very strange performance.
Yes.
I think, like most people, my biggest familiarity with him is with Rocky, where he is Mickey, where, he's Rocky's trainer. And then
I've never seen any of the Rocky films.
You've never seen any Rocky? Okay, so what's your first association with the Penguin, maybe?
It's 50% the Penguin, 50% his 4 Twilight Zone episodes.
Oh, of course, yes.
For me, he's the lead character from Time Enough at Last first.
Oh, yes.
And second, he's the Penguin. And yeah, no, this to me is like Vincent Price in Laura, right? Where it's like, wow, he was a human being at one point. Even though in this one, he's a cartoonish nihilist. Like, he's described as an individualist, but he's like this parody of a temperamental artist type who's very self-serious. He's very intellectual. He's given to sort of bad moods, always constantly sort of bewildering people with his insights into art. He looks at an abstract painting and he just understands it instantly in a way that our sort of domestic housewife character played by Merle Oberon, she's like, I don't get it. I don't understand. Non-representational art almost becomes the sort of stand-in for domestic disturbance in a certain way. It challenges traditional forms. This is the rare film from this season where I feel compelled to slightly explain the premise a little. I don't do rundowns of the plot in this show, but I will explain the scenario a little. I looked at the numbers on this, and to be or not to be, has 50,000 logs on Letterboxd, which is actually pretty low. That's significantly below the most popular Fords and Chaplins, etc. But this has 3.4 thousand. So this is the 18th most popular Lubitsch, which is really unusual for it being a late film. The basic premise is Melvyn Douglas and Merle Oberon, they're a married couple. He's a salesman. She is a rather, I'd say, neglected housewife.
Yes.
Society lady.
Yes.
And she basically embarks on an emotional affair with Sebastian, who is played by Burgess Meredith, who is probably the last person I can imagine anyone embarking on an emotional affair with. And so that kind of incongruity, we'll get to incongruity, that kind of incongruity is the source of much humor in the film.
Yes. Am I correct? He goes by the name Bastian?
This film is full of a lot of actually those interesting kind of made-up colloquialisms. Like you have keeks, which...
Keeks!
I will admit, Anya and I have been poking each other every 10 minutes or so when we're in your presence. We've been keeksing each other, which is, I swear, not a double entendre. It's literally something characters do in this movie where the married couple has a tradition where they poke each other and they go keeks.
Keeks?
And it becomes a plot point.
Keeks? A sort of signal of a turning point in the marriage is where Merle Oberon at least says,
Larry, please don't keeks me anymore.
And then there is this sort of intertitle that says, and that is when the keeks went out of their marriage. That's how you know how
that
it's
intertitle
spelled.
was shocking.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, it's late to the party of intertitles in cinema. But yes, and I mean, not only that, but you also have that lovely reveal later on where we understand the depth of the relationship between Jill, the Merle Oberon character, and Bastian when it is revealed offhandedly that her nickname for him is Snoogie.
Snoogie, yes. Well, I believe it's right after Bastian keekses Melvyn Douglas, gets a punch in the face, and then Merle Oberon going after his body. Snoogie, oh no!
Snoogie!
Snoogie? Calling that Snoogie.
So you get, it's like 3 quick jokes in a row, the keeks, the punch, and then Snoogie, all like in very quick succession.
I took note of how dense the jokes are in this. There are so many scenes in this film with, I think, tremendously well-constructed bits where they compound. Like, I think my favorite single scene in the film is Jill and Bastian have fully embarked on their emotional affair. And it is revealed that she has somehow, off screen, we don't know how, made her way over to his place. He is playing on his piano, with a beautiful view of Central Park in a Hollywood studio, a beautiful psych of Central Park, I'll say. And she comes, on frame right, leans on the piano, and both of them look at each other and leave frame. He pursues her, and we don't hear anything. He comes back into frame, Bastian does, and starts playing the jauntiest thing he's ever played in the film. So what's happened is, they've had their first sort of kiss, which might be a metaphor for something else off screen. She re-enters, clearly wrought, roiled inside. They leave again, the frame. He pursues her again. You hear a door slam off screen. So twice we've been denied visual information of key points in their relationship. And then Bastian comes back into frame, now distraught by the off-screen action. And there's a drink in front of him. Instead of pouring more, which is what you'd expect, he's a cheap bastard. So he pours it back in the bottle. Which accomplishes essentially the same character beat, but it's a wonderful little version. I mean, that's not so much a joke as it is just a lovely scene that ends on a beautiful punchline, but each individual beat in it is so well constructed and it might be one of the purest Lubitsch beats I've ever seen, where whatever happens off screen, it's in our imaginations.
I am such a lover, I think, of broad comedy that for me, the most successful bit was definitely this high wire bit of farce predicated on spousal abuse at the very end of the movie.
Yeah, the fake argument is incredible.
Oh, so good. Should we talk more about the scenario to talk about even how we get there?
We can basically say that the married couple are in divorce preliminary hearing. They find themselves through plot machinations in a case where they essentially have to pretend to argue to have the legal grounds for divorce.
In order to not admit that there was infidelity, which would be this big social faux pas, they have to stage this whole farce where they get into an argument and Melvin Douglas slaps his wife in the face. Therefore, the abuse is the justification.
There's that wonderful line.
So, you can hit a man, but you don't dare strike a woman. You coward, you.
Word for word, I can hear Lubitsch giving a line reading for that, because it's almost identical to Sig Ruman's line delivery in To Be or Not to Be of,
You can murder a man, you can kill in cold blood, but you cannot pull a man's people.
So good. But yes, it becomes this whole charade where the lawyer has to bring in his assistant as a witness and they stage this fake argument. And then Melvin Douglas is incapable of actually slapping his wife, and he keeps having to run off screen into a little room that we see and pour himself progressive drinks and then come back, try again, restage the argument the exact same way. It becomes this entire sort of production in a way that it's as funny as a joke about staging spousal abuse as I could imagine.
I think the movie doesn't quite stick the landing on why they get back together at the end. Like, this is a divorce and remarriage comedy, but this is the closest the movie gets, where they almost reconnect because of their lack of ability to have an abusive argument. The scene ends with him just the most half-hearted, barely a slap after he's had multiple drinks, and it's just been goaded into it by his wife and everyone in the room. And she looks off and says,
He had to get drunk to do it.
He had to get drunk before he could hit me.
Do this little...
It's like a fly swat. Yeah. It's so well played because that scene could have easily become, I think, quite upsetting for obvious reasons. But no, it's this kind of strangely cathartic moment between the two of them.
It is. I would agree that the sort of resolution does feel a little pat. This is a comedy of remarriage, not unlike the Philadelphia story. The ending feels a little rushed and a little pat in a way that sort of reveal in something like the Philadelphia story feels like this sort of almost like revelatory turn. Here it's like, okay, we got to kind of bring the couple back. It feels a little perfunctory, but sort of everything leading up to that I found very satisfying.
The first film I actually thought of when watching this was The Awful Truth.
Yes.
The Lubitsch film that this most recalled for me was 1 Hour with You, where it's not divorce and remarriage. 1 Hour with You takes place over the course of around 48 hours. And in that film, if everyone remembers from last season, 1 Hour with You features, Maurice Chevalier essentially having a one-night stand with Mitzi and cheating on his wife. And the comparison between this film and that, the point at hand, I think that 1 Hour with You has that brilliant scene, which is, again, it's a remake of The Marriage Circle, but 1 Hour with You does it better, where they reconnect by essentially Colette, the wife played by Jeanette MacDonald, essentially eyes wide shutting him and claiming that she had a dream. She kind of makes a big deal of this dream and kind of essentially manufactures her own affair out of thin air to even the scales, which is a fascinating term. I also think there's another kind of interesting comparison on this is that 1 Hour with You, strangely, that portrays a physical affair. That portrays, Maurice Chevalier and Mitzi, they get it on, and possibly multiple times. And yet that film doesn't cut deep. That affair is not treated that seriously, actually. It's treated as a comic affair. And this, in a strange way, the Hays Code essentially means that you cannot portray an affair in the same way as you did in 1932. And so we're left with an emotional affair.
Yeah.
And this emotional affair, though, I found almost a little more it has more lasting power in this film.
It hurts.
Jill's affair with Bastian. Yeah, it really hurts. I was watching and I'm kind of going, on one hand, I'm going, this dialogue's great. On the other hand, I'm genuinely invested. I was like, no, don't do this. You know, not with, maybe it's just not with Meredith.
This affair really grows out of a genuine sense of sort of domestic malaise. When we're introduced to this character at the very beginning, she is doing psychoanalysis. She is sort of struggling to know herself, to know her marriage. I think she said, talking about the idea of her husband, and she doesn't know what to talk about with him anymore. And she's like, oh, your husband should remain a stranger to you, somebody who you are learning to know every single day, which is, I'm a married man very recently, but this idea of in any way sort of being a mystery to my wife, it's like, I'm not doing that at all. There's no mystery to me. The little details that sort of accumulate to demonstrate how this marriage is on the rocks. It's not in these big dramatic ways. It's, well, number one, she has these recurring hiccups. The hiccups become this sort of physical manifestation. But then on Melvin Douglas's side, it's represented by this idea that he's not shaving. That it's like, that's the problem with husbands. Husbands don't shave when they're spending time with their wife. They'll shave for company, but they won't just to impress their wife. It is this very sad, but quietly sad. It's not like this melodramatic marriage on the rocks. It's just these two people who have grown accustomed to each other in ways that are really affecting the wife.
I had that in my notes. My own wording was, if we're going to look for the theme in the movie, right? The theme being not like a message, but just what the film is about, right? At heart, what is it addressing? And I think it's about overfamiliarity in marriage.
Yes, it very much is.
The main couple aren't bad for each other necessarily. They've just lost what it is. They're not on their best behavior. The honeymoon period is over.
It's the, the 7-year itch, as they call it, or something like that. That feeling of being sort of boxed in. Can I briefly mention the way this film starts? Because it's got a very bizarre sort of opening.
Yes.
I don't have the exact quotation. Maybe you do, but it opens with this title card about men. They are conquerors. They take over the world. And yet there is one place that remains to them unknown. And you immediately cut to a ladies' room.
Mm-hmm. I noted that in my second viewing where I'm like, I'm not sure this actually interfaces with what the movie's about.
Nope. Not really.
And that might be a weakness. I think you could probably just open on ladies' room and you get maybe something more germane.
It's a good gag. And there are some very good gags right at the beginning. One that had me laughing so much is the psychiatrist cajoling her about her age. And she says, oh, I'm 22. And she goes, okay, what are you really? And he goes, 24. And it's like, okay. And then he writes down in his notes, 24 ? And
then later on, this must be deliberate, where there's an offhanded line when she says she's been married for 6 years and since she was 19. So that puts her at least 25.
Yep. I didn't catch that. There you go.
Yeah. That's the thing about this film is where it has kind of that, to call back to a more recent episode, Bluebeard's eighth wife thing, where there's so much in the film. Like, I think at this point, Lubitsch was truly just untouchable as a director. Just every gesture in this film, like the staging, the interactions between the writing and the direction, are all there, and the dialogue sparkles. It doesn't maybe sparkle as hard as To Be or Not to Be, but it sparkles. There's a slight sense of aimlessness for the film where I don't quite feel that the film has this incredible driving reason to exist. It doesn't really build to where you are hoping it'll build necessarily. To me, that's best expressed by the fact that I still don't feel like I have an amazing handle on these characters. I couldn't describe them if I had to do the Plinkett test, which is describe them without referring to their physical appearance or their jobs.
Mm-hmm. I felt that the husband and the wife, Merle and Melvin, I had a pretty good handle on them. The character for me, who I struggled with, as much as I loved his performance, especially at the beginning, was Burgess Meredith, because I feel like this character starts in one place, and then as soon as the relationship becomes sort of serious, he sort of switches. We don't really get the sense of the nihilism, the tempestuous nature, all of this stuff that I immediately sort of drew Merle Oberon to him, and he just becomes sort of the romantic foil after that initial characterization. And, maybe there's a commentary in that once you get past this sort of grumpy artist facade, that beneath that he's just an average man. But I don't know, it felt maybe a little bit that he became sort of a plot function more than anything in the back half.
He really gets lost in that back half because he basically has two traits, right? He's a nihilistic, self-important artist.
Yep.
And he's also really cheap. And weirdly yes. enough, the cheap bastard part of him becomes the important part by the end, right? The only thing that seems to excite him is the prospect of getting this apartment and the divorce settlement. and he just seems like a chore to be around. So there is a certain point at which his character is written, which is he's really entertaining, but I would never want to spend 5 minutes in the same room as this man. You can't really imagine Jill. I mean, I get it on a foil sense that he's a foil for Melvyn Douglas. I don't quite buy if we're going to hang the plot on an emotional affair with this man. Perhaps he's too much of a crotchety, cheap bastard nihilist.
Mm-hmm. I will say, I think some of the plot mechanics involving him are really elegant. Specifically, I'm thinking of the element of this painting that we are told is an abstract portrait of him from one of his ex-lovers.
Yeah.
Painted him in this abstract fashion. And the wife brings home a print of it, but lies about what it's depicting. Lies that it's, she says it's not a portrait of anybody in particular, but she doesn't know that the husband had gone to the museum and found out that it was a portrait of him, and he is trying to sort of suss out her lie, and it's like, why are you lying about what this painting is of? But of course, they're all just sort of talking around it. Nobody's being honest. They're all classic sort of Lubitsch doublespeak, where it's all insinuation and trying to suss each other out. But I loved that as a plot element, and how that painting sort of comes to stand in for him as this destabilizing force in their relationship, and so sort of how that ties to his own approach to art. Something I have that's talking about abstract art that he says, it's done by indication, breaking down the traditional form, and how his presence by proxy of the photo starts to break down, the most traditional form, their marriage. I thought that was very clever.
It really destabilizes what you mentioned to me earlier in our prep for this episode as the kind of the inhibitions of Larry, the Melvyn Douglas character, says as much when he has a great line, which, he socks Burgess Meredith right in the jaw and says, sorry, that was the old-fashioned baker.
Well, there's only one thing left for me to do.
Shouldn't have done that, Baker.
I know, and I'm sorry.
Shouldn't have done it.
I slipped back into the old-fashioned baker. I probably won't do it again.
Which, that's an admission that society has trained him to restrain his base impulses. And that Burgess Meredith comes in and hell with society. Let's all act on our base impulses. Yes. I'm going to offend everyone at this party.
Yes, he's Mr. Id, Mr. Transgression, like Mr. What are the rules of society, man? I don't care. I'm an artist. And yes, he's very tiresome in this way, very entertaining way.
I love the Hungarians in the party scene. It's funny, I tried to train myself to pronounce the Hungarian catchphrase joke that she says, which means to your health.
I can't do it.
Egészségre. Egészségre.
Oh, you mean egészségre. Egészségre.
I just love the immediate rapturous reception of that line. All the Hungarians at this party that they've invited, that they immediately start only speaking in Hungarian as a result of this, and Burgess Meredith kind of provoking them a little, which means it's a bit of a disaster for Melvyn. But I do think that there was a setup there for Bastian to create a almost like Hitchcockian scene at that party that never quite, maybe I'm just asking Lubitsch to be a different director here, but this film is very low key in everything. Almost every scene that you're like, this is going to explode, ends up almost like petering out in sometimes really pleasing ways though.
By the way, did you catch that the main Hungarian character was given the name Kafka?
Yes. And also, I should say, played by Sig Rumen, who is one of our favorites. He is concentration camp Earhart. He is one of the three Bolsheviks in Ninotchka. One of my favorite. Yeah. He was a microscope scientist, apparently, which is fine. He was a terrifically interesting man. But yes, the whole psychoanalysis, the movie digs at the surrealists. It also calls out Kafka. There's Picasso knockoffs. Yeah. The film almost feels like Lubitsch poking fun at all these like very New York coded modern ideas of like psychoanalysis and modern art, daring into your soul, that sort of thing.
Yeah, very much a running thread of encroaching modernism as a threat to the stability of bourgeois middle class existence. As through all of these elements, all of them geared towards the same thing, which is sort of like destabilizing the sense of the self, destabilizing the sense of the home and the marriage, and that they're all, again, tied together. Modern art, psychoanalysis, modern literature like Kafka, and all of this stuff that's basically, asking the same question of, who are we? What is society? In this very early 20th century sort of way that we associate with the art and culture of that period.
Yeah, and it's more of an exploration of that than it is a sort of attempt to turn into a thesis. I could say like Ninotchka, for example, is a film that I think is a very clear thesis about politics and its interaction with romance.
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't seem to be creating some sort of grand statement, like you said, a thesis. It is more of a character study, sometimes comedy of remarriage, a little bit of these like sort of farcical elements. Within that, it is doing very sort of interesting, unexpected things. And, dealing with themes and ideas that I honestly didn't expect from a movie from 1941. This focus on psychoanalysis and modern art seemed to be something I would have expected later. Obviously, we associate so much Freudian and psychoanalytical ideas with people like Hitchcock, who come in the decades later. And of course, in comedy with people like Woody Allen in the 60s and 70s. And it was interesting to see that play out here. And it was not something I'd seen in any other Lubitsch films.
Yeah, I mean, I think, which is the Hitchcock film? It's Spellbound, right? Where Hitchcock famously approaches psychoanalysis, and that was not for another 4 years. Yeah, we're well into the period where the quote-unquote weak films are all quite good.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the last film I can think of in this whole retrospective where I came to the conclusion that I probably won't watch this again is probably Eternal Love, and that was 1929. And so the floor for Lubitsch is incredibly high at this point, and it makes it funny that this film is so forgotten because I think there are numerous worse films that are much more famous from this era. So the other kind of major subject of this episode that I'm really excited to talk about is you are a scholar of comedy, maybe the first scholar of comedy I've ever talked to. So congratulations.
It's a big mantle to take on. A nice bit of timing for this recording that I am just finishing up teaching a summer course right now on film comedy, which is it's really focused on American film comedy. So this stuff is very fresh on my mind. I wouldn't go so far as to call myself a comedy theorist as of yet, although, once I finish the dissertation, I might have a bit of theory to my name. This literature is something I'm pretty well familiar with. And I know as prep for this conversation, you also read a specific text that I had recommended to you as a good little breakdown. We could talk about that really quick. If anybody is familiar with the philosopher and film studies scholar Noel Carroll. He wrote an excellent little book on the subject called Humor, A Very Short Introduction, that if anybody is interested in sort of like the theoretical underpinnings of comedy as understood throughout human history, it's as good of an introduction as I could find and I could recommend. My students have to read chunks of it all the time. I feel like I'm back in teaching mode here. So broadly speaking, there are 3 to 4 sort of major theories associated with humor. All of them have been sort of considered within sort of evolutionary context, have been given some sort of analysis and cognitive context. And, in modern context, some have become more applicable than others. But the earliest one, and probably the simplest one to understand, goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. You can find sort of evidence of it in Aristotle, who is in some ways adapting from his teacher Plato, who Plato thought laughter was this very base, vulgar thing, that it kept us away from our ideal state in a certain way, which I think a lot of thinkers would challenge that now. But Aristotle basically said that we laugh at deficiencies, that we laugh at faults and flaws and ways that people fall short. And this idea was made even fuller hundreds of years later by Thomas Hobbes, and it come to be known as the superiority theory, that we laugh at fools. We laugh at people who are stupid or have bad morals or are bad at their jobs or don't know how to control their body or have bad luck or all of these things, and that we laugh in this sort of feeling of superiority, of, haha, I feel better than them. And theory even says that when we laugh at ourselves, we are often laughing at the previous version of ourselves that is worse than the version that we are now.
That's an interesting way to get around the paradox of self-deprecating humor in this, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
You're not actually making fun of yourself. You're saying, haha, it wasn't I bad.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. And almost all of these theories, I think, have a lot of insight to offer, but they're not universally applicable in almost any case. And the superiority theory is one that has a lot of holes you could poke into it, has a lot of counterexamples that you could draw from. And in terms of Lubitsch, probably not one of the most germane for reasons we'll talk about. The next one associated especially with Freud, and one that will probably come up in our conversation here. It's called the relief theory. You also see it sometimes called the release theory. And it's basically this Freudian premise that says, we are constantly suppressing our base urges, that to be a functioning society, to be good members of it, we are not doing things that we would like to do, like stealing or punching other people in the face or burning down our enemies' houses or any other bad things that people might want to do on some base level. But that when we are suppressing those things for the good of society, we are sort of building up nervous energy and nervous tension. I think that's what they call it. And that when we see spectacles of transgressive behavior, of rule breaking, of people doing things that we're not supposed to, but within the safe space of a comedy, we can laugh at those things and it releases some of that tension associated with suppression. I don't get to do those things, but I get to enjoy a vicarious spectacle of it in a space where I know there are no bad consequences. So it's a win-win. It's a very sort of mechanical idea of, the psyche is this pressure cooker that is constantly building up energy and needs this sort of release valve.
When we say something is comic relief in a drama, for example, is that a reference to relief theory or is that just a homonym?
I think it's just a homonym or maybe some sort of like derivation. I have not seen it sort of like directly tied in this explicit way, but I wouldn't be surprised if that terminology may have found its original footing in there. But I can't say I know with certainty. I think the phrase comic relief has, in fact, sometimes given some confusion to my own students when thinking about this idea, because it's not so much the idea that humor releases the tension that we feel in a story, which I feel like the term comic relief speaks to that, a story is tense and we have these characters that can make us laugh to release that tension, but more with the overarching psychic tension of existence, that we are constantly these creatures that are suppressing base impulses, and that is what's building up this nervous tension. Because of the term comic relief, which is associated with this relieving tension within the diegetic story itself, there is sometimes confusion among my students, I think, when trying to figure out this. I found myself sort of re-explaining this concept to my students sometimes, being like, don't think of it as the tension within the story. Think of it as the tension that we all feel because we have to be members of society and we have to conform and we have to not do stuff we would like to do.
Yeah, the existential tension of living in a society.
Yes, absolutely. The last one I think I'll talk about is the most sort of overarching. It is the most contemporary. It is the one that Noel Carroll personally ascribes to. And if I had a criticism of it, it would be it's such a catch-all that in certain ways it can lack a little bit of specificity. It can almost encompass all of the other theories in this broad umbrella. It's called the incongruity theory. It basically says that we laugh at things that we don't expect, which is not the most complicated idea in the world, but uses this sort of neurological concept of cognitive schemas, that we know all of these things that we don't even think about knowing, stuff that we have sort of taken as shorthand, the assumptions and taken for granted knowledge of existing that our brain sort of creates these shortcuts for. And humor sort of spotlights faults within those schemas by showing us things that we don't expect, by going against those rules or taken for granted knowledge and showing us something that goes against that is incongruous, and that we laugh at those things.
I really like how Noel Carroll characterizes it as a comparative notion. It presupposes that something is discordant with something else. The something else is how the world is or should be.
Is or should be. But we can also think about this within frameworks of narrative itself. It could be narrative expectations too. It could be the rules that have been applied of the story itself, that so many comedies break rules of reality, break rules of causality, and things like that. So schema is such a broad concept. Again, it's all of this knowledge. So it includes rules, it includes norms, but it includes the laws of gravity too. It includes the one thing I often tell my students is, you didn't know how to get to this classroom the first week you came here. You had to look at directions and look at numbers on the wall. Now, at the end of the semester, you know how to get here without thinking about it. You have developed a cognitive schema. And so if you walked to where this classroom is and suddenly there was a circus in this room, that would challenge your cognitive schema, because you've built this schema that I go this direction, this direction, this direction. It gets to the classroom. And what's here? Something I don't expect. So you can think of it in this really broad way. So things like rule breaking that are part of relief-release theory, or things like characters who are foolish and stupid. You can think of these in terms of incongruities with very little effort. It is this really sort of wide-ranging theory.
To your point about it existing within a plot or story, Carroll mentions that, even kind of misunderstanding a dramatic irony between characters can create this incongruity. I mean, one example that I thought of while rewatching this film was where Melvin Douglas wants to put a new spin on his marriage. So he starts acting out of character. So he sneaks up behind Jill and covers her eyes, and she immediately thinks, oh, whoever did this by definition must be Bastian, because my husband would never do this. That's the unspoken logic. And obviously she begins to behave as if it's Bastian, and, Melvin Douglas realizes this, and her digging her own hole is the humor there. So that's the incongruity. It's an incongruity between one character's idea of what's around them versus another.
One of the things I did make a note of this because I love this, and it is this sort of incongruous thing. You don't see this very often. A double faint. The scene ends with her.
I love that.
Yes. She faints, which is this sort of common comedy punchline, but she comes to, and then she is shocked again, and she faints within the course of 2 minutes. And this sort of like double punchline, even thinking of the structure of a joke, that you expect this punchline to happen sort of once, and then when it gets repeated in this way, that can jolt us as an incongruity in itself. It's a structural incongruity in this way.
And the details of that, I think, really help make it work, where to Melvin Douglas, each faint has a totally different context, but to her, it has the same context. She realizes it's her husband and has gone, oh no, I've revealed myself. She faints. She comes to and sees Bastian. Her logic is, oh, it was Bastian the whole time. I had a dream, right? And so she faints because she is reliving the exact same circumstance twice, creates the exact same incongruity. And the fact that the film does it without feeling repetitive is really impressive.
Yes. Well, and it's doubling down on it makes it more absurd and more incongruous. And again, narrative causality and probability can be one of these unspoken norms, one of these schemas. And so something very unlikely happening breaks it again, and then it happening again amplifies how unlikely, how improbable, and thus absurd and fundamentally incongruous it becomes in this way. But in terms of this film, the theory that I thought about the most, and I think it's one that's really interesting to think about in terms of Lubitsch, is this Freudian premise, the relief-release theory, relief or release theory, this idea that what we enjoy in humor is spectacles of transgression, of people breaking the rules, of doing things that we're not supposed to in this sort of safe context. But what I thought about in the context of Lubitsch is so fascinating, and I'm sure you've talked about this extensively, is the way his characters manage to behave transgressively or in cheeky or naughty ways within these very repressive milieus. And you can think about that in terms of the diegesis itself, in terms of things like domestic spaces, political spaces, high society spaces, these repressive milieus. But also you can think about Lubitsch within the larger system of the Hays Code himself as working within this oppressive system, self-imposed, of course, by Hollywood, but finding ways to be transgressive and poke at the eye of the censors, or to insinuate and implicate the audience in ways that feel, again, a little transgressive, but in these more boxed in ways that I think is fascinating.
You have that expressed so many times throughout the films where the actual transgressions are offloaded to you, the audience. So, by staging something off screen, he's not only just using a light touch, he's going, oh, I'm using inference because that's better for the censors. No, it also allows us to participate in the transgression on screen. It allows him to kind of wink at us and go, no, I'm not the dirty one, you are.
Yeah, it's a naughty little secret between he and us. Those Hays people, maybe they don't know, which maybe that's a naive statement. Of course they would understand, perhaps, but that we're getting one by polite society. I'm getting one by polite society within the story, and you're getting one by polite society in watching and understanding my own implications in this way.
To tie it into Carol, is a way of tying in black humor to all this I found fascinating, because you make a joke about something horrible, or, in this case, it can be about an affair, which is horrible to the parties involved. The idea that the actual thing you're joking about is not the target of the joke, but the theoretical people scandalized by it. And I think that perhaps goes some way to explaining why pre-code stuff is so thrilling, because you're not only laughing at the joke, but you're laughing at the fact that this is the 30s and soon this would essentially be outlawed in cinema. And so you're kind of laughing that, wow, they really got one over the censors, didn't they?
Again, this sort of like privileged knowledge that you are enjoying the spectacle on two levels, both within the story of characters breaking rules within the story, but also the meta story of this filmmaker and we, the audience, sort of relishing in being a little naughty, in being a little boundary pushing, but in ways that you have to be privileged with this knowledge to fully understand. You have to give it the sideways look, the wink and the nod, to be like, oh, I see what's going on here.
You watch it To Be or Not to Be, and you're not only impressed that the young captain can drop how many tons of dynamite in 2 minutes?
Yeah.
You might not believe it, but I can drop 3 tons of dynamite in 2 minutes.
Really?
Does that interest you?
It certainly does.
So much dynamite in 2 minutes, you're impressed that, wow, Lubitsch can drop that on the censors. These theories of humor not only apply, as you say, to kind of put a bow in this text, but the metatext, right? The relationship between us and the film.
That's a dynamic that I think is especially potent in Lubitsch films, just because he has this reputation as this intellect and this sophisticate, but also this person who's speaking in this language of innuendo and working within the system of Hollywood. But I often think this sort of tension between what we're watching and the metatext of how did this thing even get made is often a sort of potent one in comedy. I'm teaching this class right now, and one of the films I had them watch was Tom Green's Freddy Got Fingered, which is a film you do not hear mentioned often.
Oh, yeah.
A film you do not see mentioned often in a Lubitsch podcast, but here we are.
I'm sexy! I'm a sexy boy! Ding dong! Ding dong! Back in 45 minutes. Hey, are you guys leaving?
Why ever not?
One of the things I have them read is Roger Ebert and A.O. Scott's reviews of these, which both sort of come at this question of, are we being pranked to an extent by this movie?
Yeah.
Is this an act of surreal, aggressive anti-humor? Is this a gag on the studio itself? So these questions of metatext can often be really enriching in a comic context because it can add this extra frisson, this extra sort of tension.
I'm going to be very tempted to make the intro quote of this episode. This is a fancy restaurant. This is a fancy restaurant. And not a Lubitsch quote. Just let everyone wonder until an hour in.
Oh my goodness.
Or ding dong, ding dong. It could be any of those.
Backwards Man. Backwards Man is a personal favorite. Boy, my students have been hating that movie, which I sort of expected, but also on a meta level almost delights me.
That is a film, and this is a tangent I'm more than happy to go on, because a few years ago, we did a movie night with some friends of mine who we all love bad movies. I think we all came away with going, wow, that is like a fascinating piece of art, but also that is a difficult one. That is a torturous movie in many ways. I mean, I love it, but it is truly, it hates you.
It really does. On the discussion board, I had a student who was like, I really checked out in the scene where he swings the baby around by an umbilical cord. And I had to be like, well, you and Roger Ebert checked out at the same time. Good for you.
There's a lot in that movie where I'm just like, I can't countenance this, but it's, oh God, like the restaurant scene, I cry laughing at. I mean, as an act, probably a common refrain I have in the show whenever we talk about other films is I think I approach a lot of cinema less on the terms that it wants to be approached. And this film, actually, I think it wants to be approached in this terms, but less is like, okay, I'm invested in this, and more as an object to be looked at and gone, what the hell is this?
This is an intro class, and maybe that's a little bit why my students are struggling a bit. I don't know if I would teach it again for an intro class, but it's something I wanted to try because I find it such a compellingly strange object. I did as much as I could to be like, there's a good chance you'll hate this, and it's gross, and it's unpleasant. I had to be like, please also watch the lecture so you don't think I'm an insane person for picking this.
To tie Freddy Got Fingered back into this, and I think it can be done, is that, yeah, Freddy Got Fingered, I think, for all its ridiculousness, it is a great example of what you're talking about, this idea where the comedy is not necessarily existing inside the story, but exists between the viewer and the film and the relationship, right? Where there's this incongruity between how we are trained to receive something like a Tom Green movie even, and what this movie is giving us, that if you're on that wavelength is unbelievably funny.
Again, it is this sort of specific posture with which you approach the work. And that is equally true of Ernst Lubitsch, although it's certainly not the same posture with which you approach the work. But again, this sort of sideways look, this sort of almost excavating look where you're trying to, that you know that this work is embedded with double meanings, with innuendos, with implications, with suggestion, and therefore you are, as sort of the attentive viewer, trying to excavate that meaning as you're watching it, where you could watch it completely straightforward, and even then it would still be funny, it would still be a little saucy, because there are still some more explicit jokes, but that the real sort of depth of the work on this writing level and how it sort of interfaces with the form and how those create these implications and suggestions in the mind of the viewer, that becomes sort of this active process of creation between Ernst Lubitsch and you as the viewer.
Yeah, this rhymes a little with Dave Kerr's thought about silent films, where silent films are something of a uniquely collaborative medium because you as the audience have to finish the film because you're denied a sense, right? It's not that they're making a conscious decision not to use sound, because that was not really that feasible at that point. But the fact that you don't have sound means that you are forced to collaborate on the soundscape as the viewer and finish the film. And it really feels like Lubitsch carried that over to his sound pictures in a way that very few other directors managed to do. We're still being asked to finish his films for him. It's a self-checkout of cinema.
Yeah, I honestly, he made the transition into sound, got to be like one of the most smoothly and effectively. You would probably know more intimately but like, what do his transition era films look in those very late 20s, early 30s, those first sound films? Do you see any growing pains with Lubitsch?
You do, and it's a lot of it's technologically based. I mean, it is interesting where his silent era ended with kind of a whimper. Eternal Love is a film that he was clearly not that enthused about while making it. It was an obligation. But let's compare like his last great sound work. I have to keep qualifying myself because there's so many exceptions, because The Patriot it's probably good. But his last great surviving silent work is Student Principal in Heidelberg, which is just a flowing film. It has gorgeous camera movements. It's Lubitsch at the height of his visual powers. And then Love Parade comes around, and he feels constricted technologically in the way that virtually all talkies of 1929 are, right? The camera is essentially static. It moves like single-digit number of times, right? And when it does, it isn't all that elegant. But immediately, he's going, what can I do with this? Oh, I'm going to have a solo by a dog. I'm going to have a musical number where we see it from the point of view of a bunch of people looking from outside into a window. By Monte Carlo, a year later, he's doing musical numbers over the phone on trains. This is the common story of the sound era, right? People were mourning what was lost, but Lubitsch was like, well, what about these new tools? And he fully, I think, capitalized on the possibilities by 1932, because that's the Trouble in Paradise. You have 1 Hour with You. You have The Smiling Lieutenant. You have a ton of great cinema coming out in one calendar year. But weirdly enough, I think this is worth noting too, is that he kind of got more and more maximalist. The Merry Widow is probably my favorite of his pre-code films, which is not that popular of an opinion, but it's my favorite. And it's insane. It is as vibrant. There's whip hands in that movie. I mean, the camera is constantly moving. It's doing these acrobatics by Lubitsch standards. And then he retreats into conservatism aesthetically, right? As soon as he takes 3 years off, becomes, head of production at Paramount, doesn't go great, comes back in 1937 with Angel, and that's the template for the rest of his career. And That Uncertain Feeling fits in with that perfectly, where he's back and he's the most soft-spoken formalist you've ever seen, right? He's gone from let's pump it up in Merry Widow comparatively. I mean, he's no Reuben McMillan but now it's like watching films by someone who's incapable of anything above a whisper. That's what's beautiful about them.
There is such a refinement in his work, and I don't mean just in this cultural sophistication sense, but on this formal register that every movement, every design choice feels so extremely deliberate, particular, but subtle. It is not, like you said, it's not this big expressivism that now I do really want to see The Merry Widow, though. That does sound very good.
Part of what moved me in the first place to make a podcast about Lubitsch is that my favorite period in his career is the period that on paper is the least germane to my sensibilities. I mean, my favorite movie on most days is Napoleon, and that's the most maximalist, flamboyant movie ever made. And yet my favorite period by my favorite director is his most toned down period. It's his most restrained period.
His late style period?
Yeah, his late style period. I mean, as late as in this case, he was in his early 50s, right? And he died at 55. So, and that paradox has always gotten to me, because on paper, the pre-code era should be my favorite, because the moment when he's exploring all the possibilities on paper of a medium. But I just think he was so good at this. I can't think of anyone who's ever done this classical style as well as he does, except for maybe Ford. Are there any other kind of elements, the theories of comedy and how they tie into Lubitsch, any moments or anything that you really want to mention before we kind of officially wrap this episode up?
Yeah. Like I said, I did want to think maybe a little bit about this question of the superiority theory, because again, it's one that on a certain level I said maybe doesn't apply as much to Lubitsch, just because so many of his characters are so witty and intelligent and urbane. But I'm thinking about it more, and I think about all of these characters are also defined by their flaws, their vanities, their obsessions, their compulsions. So I guess in this way, they do sort of fit in this fool paradigm, but they are so much of Lubitsch's humor is finding fools within these sophisticated milieus, that the fool doesn't have to be the guy in the clown makeup with his pants falling off. It could be the rich, sophisticate who is nonetheless ignorant or who is vain or does not understand social convention. I mean, I recently rewatched To Be or Not to Be. Joseph Tura, Jack Benny, and Carol Lombard as these images of actorly vanity, of total self-obsession in this way. So even this theory that I was maybe giving short shrift to, it is interesting to think of what are the flaws that define Lubitsch characters, because as much as I think the superiority theory is maybe a limited theory, it is interesting to think about how many all comic characters are defined by their flaws in some way or another. And that's interesting to think about in terms of Lubitsch.
Especially in To Be or Not to Be, because I really appreciate David Kellett's enunciation of this idea that film is a celebration of the flaws of its main characters. There's no character arcs in that movie. No one actually overcomes any flaws. It's just these flawed people are able to overcome things. And the film posits that as an inherently beautiful humanistic thing that is anti-fascist.
Yes. And this, I think, is something that my students maybe even struggle with when talking about the superiority theory. They hate this word, superiority. They hate this idea that they might be laughing at characters because they feel better than them. That makes them feel gross. And I think somebody like Lubitsch, and really this is true of so many comic characters, it's like, hey, just because we are laughing at the flaws, the foibles, the faults does not mean that they're not also sort of engaging on this human level. That in these flaws, we laugh at them, but maybe we also laugh at how relatable they are, how human they are, how that frailty and falling short is in some way the human condition, but that it's also important to recognize that one of the defining features of so much of comedy, outside of things like dark comedy, is that it builds towards this happy ending. It builds towards this resolution, this formation of couples, this overcoming of obstacles, this betterment of the self sometimes. And so characters being flawed and us feeling superior to them is in some way can be this transitionary state. It can be this state on the road to enlightenment for the characters. And in some ways that is, I think, a very optimistic notion that so many of these characters, even if they don't grow, they at least overcome.
That's a really humanistic interpretation of the theory of superiority. Well, thank you so much for coming on to discuss all this, Lance. This has been incredibly informative. I can't recommend the book you have shoved into my hands enough. It is Humor by Noel Carroll. Thank you so much for coming on.
You are very, very welcome. It was such a pleasure to be on. I love talking about Lubitsch. I love seeing a new one of his films. I love talking about comedy. I just recorded, like I said, hours and hours of lectures, and I'm still not sick of it.
Next week, Tim Brayton joins us to discuss Sullivan's Travels and Mr. Preston Sturges. Head over to ernstcast.com for information as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing this season and other resources such as show notes and our Discord server. How Would Lubitsch Do It is a production of Moving Image Agency. Eden Cote-Foster was our dialogue editor for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on whatever podcast platform you happen to use. It helps other people find our podcast and therefore find Ernst Lubitsch. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast was produced on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples.
Keeks? Don't do that, Baker.